What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one you've built a life with, was hiding a secret so big it could destroy everything? Rava Sharma seemed like the perfect husband, successful, caring, and devoted to his family. But Meera, his wife, had no idea that behind his charming demeanor, a world of lies was waiting to come crashing down. It all started with a strange phone call, one that would change everything. Was this the beginning of something much more dangerous than she could ever imagine? As Meera dug deeper into her husband's life, she uncovered a secret so devastating it could only lead to heartbreak. The truth wasn't just a betrayal, it was a deadly one. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? How does one person handle a lifetime of lies that threaten to shatter everything they hold dear? Welcome to True Crime Theatre HQ for more trending true crime stories like this. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so that when it is released, you don't miss crime stories like this. And don't forget to share them with your friends. Rava and Meera's marriage seemed like a story everyone would admire. It was traditional, arranged by their families, but it worked for them. Both came from families that valued respect, loyalty, and the deep bond that marriage brought. Rava, a successful businessman in the construction industry, had worked hard to get where he was. He was driven, focused, and determined to build a life not just for himself, but for Meera and their growing family. Meera, on the other hand, was the embodiment of what a wife and mother should be in her world. She was devoted to her family, caring for their home and nurturing their daughter, Ananya, with love and patience. Their daughter was a symbol of everything they had worked for: a future, a family, a legacy. Everything seemed perfect. The couple had a life built on mutual respect, love, and a shared vision for their future. The respect was there, the understanding was there, and to the outside world, their marriage was everything it was supposed to be. But as the days passed, things began to change in ways Meera couldn't ignore. Rava's work began to demand more of his time. His trips to other states, long meetings, and late-night calls became more frequent. At first, Meera didn't think much of it. After all, Rava had built his career with a single focus. She knew it was important for the family's future. But the longer it went on, the more Meera felt something shifting. Rava was distant. His once warm smile when he came home was replaced with tired eyes and short, distracted conversations. The affection they once shared seemed to fade slowly, like a piece of fabric fraying at the edges. What bothered Meera the most were the phone calls that came at odd times, late at night, or when he was supposed to be busy with work. He would rush out of the room, sometimes not even letting her see who was calling. The messages, too, were strange. Why did he seem so protective of his phone now? The change was subtle at first, but Meera couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She tried to push it out of her mind, thinking it was just the stress of work or the pressures of their growing family. But as time went on, her suspicions grew. There was no denying it anymore. Something was wrong, and Meera couldn't understand why Rava, the man she trusted with her life, was acting this way. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. The once open, loving relationship they shared now seemed clouded by secrets. Why was Rava keeping things from her? Why the sudden need for so much privacy? And more importantly, who was he speaking to when he thought no one was watching? Questions filled Meera's mind. Doubts she never wanted to entertain crept in. And with each passing day, the distance between them seemed to grow, leaving Meera feeling more alone than ever before. What was he hiding? Why the secrecy? The answers were just beyond her reach, but they were closer than she could ever have imagined. In 2015, everything changed in an instant. It wasn't some dramatic confrontation or an outburst that shattered Meera's world. It was a single phone call, one that seemed like any other call until the woman on the other end spoke. "Is Rava there? Tell him I need to talk to my husband," she said. Those words cut through Mira like a knife. Her husband? Mira froze, her heart pounding. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. A strange woman referring to Rava as her husband. How could this be possible? That moment was the breaking point, the instant when everything Mira thought she knew about her marriage came crashing down. She tried to push it away, to dismiss it as some sort of mistake. But deep down, she knew this was no mistake. The unease she'd felt for months now had a name, and it was betrayal. It was no longer just a feeling of distance between her and Rava. It was something much more painful, much more deliberate. The suspicion that had been growing in the back of her mind now consumed her. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Mira had to know the truth. She decided, against everything she believed in, to secretly investigate. She couldn't just confront Rava without understanding what was really going on. What if she was wrong? What if it was all just a misunderstanding? No, she couldn't risk confronting him without the proof. One evening, as Rava slept soundly beside her, Mira made her move. She quietly took his phone, the device that had become his prized possession, something he'd guarded so closely. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it, and what she found would forever alter the course of her life. The phone was full of affectionate messages between Rava and a woman named Priya. These weren't casual conversations. They were full of love, promises, and shared moments that she had never been a part of. She read them over and over, her heart sinking with each word. There was no mistaking it. Rava had been hiding an affair. But that was just the beginning. Mira's investigation didn't stop there. She couldn't stop now. She had to understand the full scope of the betrayal. And what she uncovered next was far worse than she ever expected. Priya wasn't just a lover, she was Rava's second wife. They had married secretly in 2013, 2 years before their daughter was born. As if that wasn't enough, Priya and Rava had a child together, a child Mira never knew existed. The shock hit Mira like a wave, knocking the breath out of her. How could Rava have done this to her? How could he have lived a whole second life, keeping it all from her? This wasn't just an affair, it was a double life, a betrayal that was far beyond what she had ever imagined. Now, Mira was faced with an impossible choice. Should she confront him with what she knew now? Should she call him out on his lies, exposing everything in an instant? Or should she gather more evidence, get even more proof to ensure she wasn't making a mistake? Her heart told her one thing: confront him. But her mind told her to wait, to gather the full story, to understand the depth of his deceit before making a move. But how long could she wait? How long could she live with this pain, knowing the truth but not confronting it? The tension inside Mira was unbearable. Every moment felt like it was pushing her closer to a breaking point. She didn't know if she could face him, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life, their life, was never going to be the same again. The day of the confrontation arrived. Mira had all the evidence she needed: messages, phone records, and the undeniable truth that Rava had been living a double life. Her hands shook as she held the phone, the very same device that had betrayed him, knowing what was coming next. It was time to face the man who had promised to love and protect her, only to destroy everything in one cruel, selfish act. When Rava walked through the door that evening, he had no idea that the woman he thought he knew so well was about to expose the lies he'd been carefully hiding for years. Mira didn't greet him with the usual smile or small talk. She stood in the living room, tense, her expression unreadable. She wasn't ready for pleasantries. She wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine. Not anymore.
"Rava, who is Priya?" Mira asked, her voice steady but cold.
Her heart hammered in her chest as she waited for his response. He froze for a moment, his face falling into a mask of shock. But Mira had seen the look before, the one where he tried to cover up the truth, the one where he thought his charm would save him. Rava quickly tried to brush it off, his words stumbling as he denied everything. "Priya, she's just a work acquaintance, nothing more. This isn't what you think." He spoke as if the words could erase the truth, as if Mira hadn't already seen the messages between them. Messages filled with love, promises, and affection. He tried to convince her that it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a fleeting mistake that didn't mean anything. But Mira wasn't buying it. The pain inside her chest boiled over, and with every word he spoke, her anger grew. "You think this is just a mistake? You think I'm stupid enough to believe that? You've been living a lie, Rava. Our life, our marriage, it was just a facade to you." The pain in her voice was raw, as if every sentence cut through her like glass. The woman she thought she knew had disappeared. In her place was a man full of deceit, selfishness, and betrayal. The more she spoke, the more Rava's panic grew. He knew he couldn't keep the lie going, but he couldn't face the consequences either. He tried to justify it, to beg her for forgiveness, to claim that everything could go back to normal. But Mira wasn't listening anymore. The words didn't matter. The truth was out, and it had already shattered her. "You betrayed me. You betrayed everything we built. And now you want me to just forgive you? You're a liar, Rava. I'm done with this." Mira's anger was no longer just words. The weight of her heartbreak pressed down on her, and she couldn't hold back the tears. How could he do this to her? How could he destroy their family, their trust, with someone else, with a whole second life? And worse, how could he still act as if it was nothing? Rava, cornered and feeling the pressure, snapped. His mind was no longer rational, his emotions too far gone. In a fit of rage, he reached for the nearest object, a wooden stick that lay on the floor. Without thinking, he raised it and struck Mira with it. The blow landed hard on her head, and in that moment, time seemed to freeze. Mira's body crumpled to the floor, her life slipping away with a single, violent act. The silence that followed was deafening. Rava stood there, his breath heavy, his body trembling as he stared at the lifeless form of his wife. The realization hit him too late. He had just destroyed the one thing he had left, the only person who ever truly believed in him. He had killed her, and no apology, no excuse could ever undo the damage he had done. In the stillness, Rava's mind went blank. His world, once built on lies, now collapsed around him. What had he done? The silence in the house was broken only by Rava's frantic breaths. He stood over Mira's lifeless body, his mind racing as panic set in. His world had just shattered, and all he could think about was how to cover his tracks. His once calm, collected demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a deep fear that gripped him. He couldn't let anyone know the truth. Not yet. Not until he could figure out a way to hide what he had done. Rava quickly grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the police. His voice was strained, almost too loud, as he tried to sound panicked and distressed. "Hello? Police? Someone broke into my house? My wife? She's been attacked. You need to come quickly." He repeated the story over and over, hoping that the authorities would believe him, that they would think a stranger had broken into their home and murdered Mira during a robbery. But as he waited for the police to arrive, doubt began to creep in. Would they believe him? Would they see through his lies? He rushed around the house, trying to make it look like a scene of chaos, shuffling furniture, opening windows, making it look like an intruder had forced their way in. He was in such a hurry that nothing seemed right, nothing seemed real. His panic turned into clumsy desperation, and the scene he created didn't feel convincing at all. The mess he made didn't match the story he was trying to tell. When the police finally arrived, they found Rava standing in the middle of the living room, his eyes wide with feigned shock. He pointed to Mira's body on the floor and told them the same story he had rehearsed. There had been a break-in, and she had been killed by an intruder. His voice trembled as he described the supposed robbery, but something didn't add up. The investigators immediately noticed the inconsistencies. There were no signs of forced entry. The windows and doors were undisturbed. No locks had been broken. The furniture wasn't tossed around in a way that indicated a struggle, but rather, it appeared to have been rearranged hastily, almost in a way that made it look like Rava had been trying to create a scene. It wasn't the work of a random intruder. Something about it all felt staged. The police also noted the lack of any defensive wounds on Mira. If she had been attacked by a stranger, she would have fought back. But there were no signs of struggle, no marks on her hands, nothing to indicate that she had tried to defend herself. The more they looked around, the more the pieces didn't fit. They began to suspect that Rava wasn't telling them the whole truth, that the story he was spinning was just that, a story. As the hours passed, the investigators started piecing together the facts. They went through Mira's phone, they spoke to neighbors, and they dug deeper into Rava's background. Slowly, the cracks in his story began to widen, revealing a man who had been hiding more than just a simple affair. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. This was no random break-in. This was something much more personal. And as the evidence continued to mount, Rava's world, already built on lies, began to crumble further. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before the police connected all the dots. Rava could feel the walls closing in, and the fear that had once pushed him to cover up the murder was now the thing that would bring him down. As the investigation progressed, the police began to dig deeper into Rava's story, their suspicions growing with each passing moment. The inconsistencies in his initial account, the lack of forced entry, the unconvincing scene he had staged, were just the beginning. But what truly sealed Rava's fate were the small details that no one could have anticipated. Neighbors, who had been interviewed as part of the investigation, reported hearing loud arguing coming from Rava and Mira's house the night of the murder. This wasn't the behavior of a victim and an intruder. It was the sound of a couple in the midst of a heated confrontation. No one had heard the sounds of a break-in, no sounds of a struggle, or anything to suggest that an outside force was involved. What they had heard was a fight between two people, one of whom would never walk through that door again. As the police continued their search, they turned their attention to Rava's phone records. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. There, hidden in plain sight, were text messages and phone calls between Rava and a woman named Priya, messages filled with love, promises, and plans for the future. But it didn't stop there. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about Priya. She wasn't just a lover, but Rava's second wife. Married in secret, with a child together, their relationship had been kept completely hidden from Mira. For years, Rava had lived a double life, maintaining the facade of a loving husband and father while keeping another family a world away. Mira, the woman who had trusted him with her heart, her future, had unknowingly become a victim of his deception, a betrayal that had been building for years. The shock of it all was almost too much for the investigators to comprehend. How could one man be so deceitful? How could he live this way, with two lives running parallel, neither ever crossing paths, until one day everything came crashing down? The police had all the evidence they needed, the calls, the messages, the neighbors' testimony. They all pointed to the same tragic truth. Rava's carefully constructed web of lies had finally unraveled, but still, he refused to come clean. faced with overwhelming evidence, the walls closing in around him, Rava's resolve finally broke. He couldn't keep up the charade any longer. In a moment of crushing despair, he confessed to the murder of his wife, Mira. His voice shook with guilt, fear, and anger. He explained that it had been the argument that had pushed him over the edge. The woman he had deceived for so long, the woman who had trusted him more than anyone, had finally found out the truth. And in a fit of rage and desperation, he had struck her. It wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was years of lies, anger, and guilt that had built up to this point. The confession came too late to undo the damage. Mira was gone, and Rava's double life had caught up with him. The truth was out, and the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. In the courtroom, Rava faced the consequences of his actions. His defense team tried to argue that his brutal act of violence was nothing more than a momentary fit of rage, that in the heat of the moment, he had lost control. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by guilt, desperate to save his crumbling marriage, and unable to think clearly in a moment of emotional turmoil. But the court saw through this argument. The evidence told a different story. The premeditated nature of the crime became clear as the investigation unfolded. The planning, the lies, the double life, all of it pointed to a man who had carefully constructed his own reality, only to destroy the woman who had once been his partner, his family. The police had pieced together his deception, his affair, and his second marriage. Mira had been betrayed long before the fatal confrontation. The murder was the tragic end to years of lies. The impact of Rava's actions on Mira's family was profound. Her parents, who had raised her with love and care, were left to mourn the daughter they had lost far too soon. Their grief was matched by the devastation felt by Mira's daughter, who would grow up without her mother, without the warmth and support that every child deserves. No defense could undo the damage caused by a man who had torn apart not only a marriage, but an entire family. Rava was convicted of the murder of his wife, Mira. His lies, his betrayal, and his violence had cost him everything. His freedom, his family, and his integrity. There would be no turning back. The consequences of his actions were irrevocable, and no amount of regret could ever bring Mira back. The question remains, could this betrayal have been avoided? Could Rava have been honest with his wife, faced the truth, and saved the life he destroyed? The answer is clear. A single choice, a single moment of honesty, could have changed everything. But once the lies began, there was no turning back.